Warhammer 40,000 Renegades, Lord of Excess by Rich McCormick. Chapter 16. Edward was first in line today. That was good. He hadn't been able to sleep. The hunger was too bad. So he'd packed up his sleeping roll, hidden in the usual spot, and made his way down to the church. Unfortunately, so had Sewell. Sewell wasn't a bad kid. He just managed to find the worst in everything. Trouble followed him like a bad smell. A bad smell followed him as well, the result of a life spent squatting in Serene's ruined buildings. "I heard they've run out again," the young man said, scratching his shaved head. The habit annoyed Edward. Sewell's face annoyed Edward. Even his voice annoyed Edward. The older man rolled his eyes involuntarily. "Don't be simple," Edward sighed. "We're here first. They missed 1 week, they're not going to miss another." He watched his words over Sewell's head as the youth hopped from foot to foot and breathed into his hands. A location above the planet's thick cloud layer meant that Serene's overcity was usually cold, but it was especially frigid before the sun came up. Yeah, Sewell said, nodded to imagined agreement. "My mate told me that it's gone for good this time. They've only got a little bit left. They've given that to the rich families." He spat on the ground. A coil of steam rose up from the gobbet of mucus. "He's down in the Undercity, and he says they don't even harvest the grass anymore, let alone refine it. Your mate doesn't know shit. They'd have riots in the streets if they stopped the supply." Sewell tapped the side of his head. "Think about it. When was the last time you saw sophisticants unloading the shipment? All they do now is walk the streets looking for heads to crack. You know I'm right, Ed." "Don't talk like that, and don't call me Ed." He hoped his brusque tone would stop the youth before he carried on. But a needle of fear jabbed at Edward's spine as he let the taboo thought enter his mind. What if Sewell was right? He shivered in the cold early morning air. It had been a week since he'd been able to get his hands on some of the stim they'd called runoff. Even then it was just 1 vial. It was the lowest grade stuff he knew. The junk left over when they brewed the rejuvenant treatments. They used to ship that stuff to Terra, his mother had told him, back when Serene had a steady stream of Imperial ships calling at its void port. Now what was left of it went to the top families, and they were stuck with the dregs. Some bought it, trading trinkets and favours for their fix. Others fought for it, killing and maiming their friends and family members for barrels of the stuff. In the Undercity, where the grass was refined, gangs fought and died over the supply lines, victors earning the right to sell it to the consumers above the clouds. He just sold his worship, turned up to church, bowed before the Saviour, spoke the words they asked him to say. His worship was cheap, now, anyway. Sold to the highest bidder. He didn't care about much beyond runoff. The irony bit at his belly. He'd been born to be a priest, and had begun his studies on this world's most beautiful and ancient place of worship. That life had been snatched away from him by the same crime that saw so many of Serene's buildings destroyed, reduced to the rubble and rock of ancient ancestors. He was to be the leader of a flock. Now he was just another beast in one. "I'm telling you, man, the Saviour's given up on us," Sewell said, snapping Edward out of his reverie. "Shut up," he hissed in response. He didn't like the kid, but he didn't want to see him get hurt. Not when they were so close to getting their fix. "The sophisticants will hear you. Talk like that will get your legs broke." He shot a furtive glance at the hulking figure by the door, a spiked club hanging from his black leather belt. Its hooded head swung left and right across the congregation of bedraddled souls as they lined up for their offering. He remembered a time before the runoff, but only barely. He'd seen the Saviour himself once, seen him with his own eyes. He'd been a child, barely in his 10th year when he'd been bundled into the undercroft of the Cathedral of the Bounteous Harvest. He'd huddled in the dark for hours, scared and terrified, as the roof shook, as bigger boys stifled sobs, as their world caved in around them, until the old wooden doors had cracked open, and heroes came to deliver them into the light. He wore imperial purple and shining gold, and he was tall as an angel of myth. Except he wasn't a myth, he was real, and he was their planet's new ruler. He brought a new world with him. Serene's governor was deposed, some said violently, its nobles' families purged, and its ancient traditions washed away overnight, all except one, veneration of the Saviour. In his triumph, he threw open the planet's stores, giving access to vast hoards of treasure, technology, and, of course, stims. The grass had been harvested for its use in rejuvenate treatments, But the Imperium's botanists knew well its secondary purposes. Careful cultivation and refinement could make a potent combat stimulant that boosted muscle cultivation, bone growth, and aggression. Edward didn't know that. He just knew that runoff made his frail body seem powerful, strengthened his limbs and his resolve to the point that he felt he could run through marble walls. It made him feel strong, vital, perfect. For a time. Soon would come the blinding muscle pains, the frenzied rages, the strange visions. Last week he'd snapped back to consciousness outside, his eyes dry and burning, sore from staring unblinking at the purple scar in the sky. It was bigger than he'd ever seen it. He swore he'd crawled back into his makeshift nest that morning and told himself he couldn't sleep, when really he was afraid to. He saw the scar still, every time he closed his eyes. A small price to pay, he decided, as he stepped forward to receive his charity. It tasted already, so sweet it was almost sickly. Soon it would be running down his throat, coating his insides, filling him with warmth, radiant warmth. The sides of his tongue tingled in anticipation. He held his hands out to accept the bowl. There was no bowl. He looked up into the hard face of a woman who regarded him with bloodshot eyes. There was no sympathy in that red. "The Saviour blesses you, my child," she said. Edward stood dumbfounded. "What?" he asked, voice weak. "Where's the runoff?" "The Saviour's blessing is enough. His benevolence is all his citizens require. But I need it," he whimpered. "Tough," she said, religious tone giving way to rougher speech. "We ain't got none, now get out," she jutted her jaw. Sewell appeared at his shoulder, his sour smell a pungent miasma. "See?" Sewell said. "Told you so. Saviour's given up on us." "He wouldn't do that to us," Edward whispered, eyes flickering from the woman to Sewell, and back again to the woman. He was pleading. "He wouldn't. I know him. I've seen him." The woman raised her hand in threat. "You've seen nothing, you filthy wretch. Now get out." "Yes, he would," Sewell said. "He's up there in his palace now. I bet giving all the best stuff to his high-born lapdogs, and looking down at the rest of us rotting in the streets." He barked a bitter laugh. "Sure, the big families make a song and dance about the challenges, but the system is rigged. Strive for perfection, they say. Anyone can succeed. But they hoard all the best stuff and feed it to their freaks. Get them to kill any of us whenever we try to challenge them." Sewell was ranting now, spittle forming at the edge of his split lips. The sophisticant, attracted by the clamour, turned in their direction, the calm face of his golden mask impassive. "Stop, Sewell," Edward said. "You'll get us in trouble. We only want a little bit, right? Just enough for today. There'll be more tomorrow. It'll be fine tomorrow." He turned back to the woman, reaching out to her with rough hands. "Please," he said, "you must have some. Just a little bit." She backhanded him across the face, and he stumbled backwards, catching a foot on the worn step. He toppled to the ground, and the wind left his body as he landed painfully on his ribs. "Oi!" Sewell yelled. "You can't do that to him. Who gives you the right?" "I can do whatever I want, scum," the woman snarled. She raised a long leather boot and planted it powerful into Edward's chest. He felt something give way, an audible snap accompanied by a lance of sharp pain. He anticipated more kicks, and tried to tuck himself into a ball, but the blows didn't come. He opened an eye, and watched as Sewell leapt from rag-clad feet, tackling the woman. They tumbled up the steps and landed in the sprawl of limbs, her ceremonial robes restricting her ability to right herself. Sewell was faster. "Leave him alone!" the younger man shouted as he managed to climb onto the woman's back, pinning her arms in place. He turned his head to check on his downed friend, and opened his mouth to speak. "Here, Ed, are you all right?" He didn't finish his question, as a spiked club slammed into the side of his face. Skin, muscle, and bone were pulped by the force of the blow, as the hulking sophisticant swung his weapon in a full arc that caved in Sewell's skull. His body sat up for a moment, still astride the woman, before her frantic writhing sent it slumping to the church floor. Edward tried to scream, but the pain in his chest caught the sound as he tried to fill his lungs, and it became a whimper. Others offered their voices instead. A chorus of screams and shrieks rose from the others who had filtered in for their weekly rations. There was fear in the air, but anger too. It had been a week since their last supply as well, and word of the shortages had clearly filtered into the back of the queue. Braver and more desperate members of the crowd surged forwards, howling epithets at the sophisticant and the woman. "Murderer!" one man screamed. His too tight skin threatened to tear like parchment as the muscles in his neck bulged. He was almost as big as the sophisticant who faced him down with his eternally impassive glare. crowd surged forward, pushing the big man in the process. It was all the incitement the sophisticant needed for further violence, and he swung a two-handed blow with his mace in the man's direction. He ducked the blow, letting it cave in the chest of the woman behind him, and came up with an uppercut into the underside of the brute's jaw, jarring his sculpted golden mask upwards, and exposing the lower half of his face. The skin was pink and puckered, as if it had been burned, and there were no lips to speak of, just a rubberized tube that snaked its way up the face and out of sight. The crowd took their chance, and they swarmed the sophisticants, pulling at his arms and giving him no space to swing his wicked mace. Knives and shivs were produced from sleeves and pockets, their glint catching in the cold morning light before they were driven into the masked figure's torso. From his position on the floor, Edward saw the sophisticant disappear under the conglomeration of bodies, the woman further away, putting a makeshift altar between herself and the crowd, as if she was there to provide her sermon. "Children of the Saviour," she called, "we are one under his light. I beseech you, stop." It was fruitless. The congregation had the smell of death in their noses now, their collective wisdom sanctioning their righteous violence. Two women closed on her from either side of the altar, improvised weapons in their hands, a shard of coloured glass and a mason's hammer. "Go away," the woman screamed. "I have nothing for you." But her authority had been pricked. The people who moments before waited obediently for her benediction would offer her no mercy. She slumped to her knees as the mob advanced, their wide smiles showing darkened teeth and purple gums. He didn't want to see what happened next. He crawled through legs, whimpered as knees and feet caught his broken ribs. Back towards the entrance, he heard the crack of hammer on bone as the weapon struck the woman's skull. It was a sound he had heard too many times before. He heard the exultant cry that came with it, howled into the freezing air of the morning. This crowd had their prize. Now they would curdle, would turn on each other, their desires not so easily stated that a few lives would fill them up. He had lived this life long enough to see the rot behind Serene's beauty. He pulled himself to his feet, bracing an arm across his broken chest, and barking with the pain. He half ran, half stumbled towards the church doors, and stepped out into the bright blue morning. A statue stood at the centre of the crossroads. When he was young, serene statues showed birds of paradise, mythical beasts, men and women of history and legend. Now every statue had been crudely altered so it depicted the same figure, its forearms raised in triumph. "I hate you!" he screamed at the statue. The riots continued into the night. Conglomerates of humanity spilling out from churches and bars, narcotic dens and hamblocks. They burned and smashed as they moved. Their mass of motivations, anger, pleasure, frustration, indulgence, fear, and transgression, all resulting in the same outcomes. Destruction. Pain. Bavisk watched them from the Cathedral of the Bounty's harvest. The Noise Marine had made his home in the ancient structure, primarily for the acoustics. But he had completed some modifications over the years that he had spent on Serene. The pipe that had once been the primary delivery method of refined solipsa sap to the Overcity had been expanded and turned outwards, becoming an amplifier for the song of his congregation. It was a dirge tonight, a plaintive song, mourning, echoing the mood of his cadre of noise marines. They longed to be back among the stars, bringing the music of the apocalypse to new worlds and new realities. He understood their yearning. He too wanted the sublime. Instead, he saw the mundane in an orgy of petty destruction. "My people are restless tonight," Xantine said, at Bavisk's side. His brother often spent time at the cathedral, when he wasn't availing himself of Quarantoon's collection of Neverborn, or communing with the demon that he had invited into his body. As the site of his enduring victory on the world, this was a symbolic location for the leader of the Adored, but Bavisk also knew that his brother valued his company and his advice. Xantine's web of confidence had never been wide, even among the egotists of the Emperor's children. He had always been particularly distrustful of his peers, but his time on Serene had only reduced their number. Zarquil's betrayal had affected him greatest of all. "They are killing each other," Bavisk said. "Will we stop them?" He knew the answer before he asked the question, but after millennia together, they both had their roles to play. "Stop them? Why ever would we do that?" Xantine asked. "Pain is the price of perfection. The strong will survive, and the world will advance. This is a lesson you have forever struggled with, Bavisk. You are as old as I am, but you still do not understand the motivations of mortal. Stick to your music. Let me deal with the complexities of the soul. These are the seeds of insurrection." "No," Xantine snapped. "This is the fulfillment of my vision. The strong taking control from the weak. You speak like our departed brother, so small-minded, so desperate for the next fleeting pleasure, unable to see the culmination of my genius. He sighed, visibly softening his demeanour. I am so close for Visk. A new society. A perfect society. Serene is a model for the future of the galaxy, with sensation unchanged and ambition rewarded. The Corpse Emperor could not achieve it. Even Father could not achieve it. Only I have the clarity of vision to carry this to fruition. Xantine raised a fist. Others will try to take this from me and claim this success for their own. Sarkville tried. I fear he still tries, plotting and scheming from whatever pit he rots in as we speak. He always wanted control of this world. He turned to Visk, his turquoise eyes boring into the Noise Marine's skin. Not like you, old friend. You would not take this from me. Visk did not reply, and Xantine tried to let the question drift out into the night air without an answer. He could not. Would you? Visk met his warlord's gaze, his disfigured face unreadable. For once, the mouths on his neck were quiet. I do not covet this world, the Noise Marine replied. I do not understand why you do. He turned back to the city, catching a final glimpse of the frothing mass of humanity as they flowed through the streets like blood through arteries. Excuse me, brother. I must join my choir, Visk said as he descended to lead the evening's chorus. Okay, so I'm slightly confused by the time skips, because in the last chapter it said decades, in part 2 it said 8 years, and now it says a decade. Like, how long have they been on the world? I'm not sure if they're jumping back, jumping forward. No, because this is clearly... Yeah, I'm a bit confused. A little bit confused. But... I wonder what Visk and his Noise Marines are going to do. Because they're clearly not happy being there. They want off. Sooner rather than later, it would seem. And I really hope they get to leave the world. I think Visk is absolutely correct. I think there's going to be an absolute bloodbath on their hands. Quite literally. Interesting that they mentioned Sarkville. Because, I mean, although we didn't confirm the kill, it's very clear that he has... It very much implied that he was definitely dead. Like, even, like, missing an arm, wounded, and absolutely... You're like, how could he survive? I'm not sure. Like, it seemed to imply it was a long drop that would just pulverize even a Space Marine's body into just meat. Also, I like seeing Edward. He was the kid that Arcat told to hide in the church when the Genestealer cult was doing their evolution thing. It's nice that they called back to him. I wonder if we'll see him again. I'm pretty sure he's not going to be a major character. I think he's just there to let us know how things are going on the planet, which is cool. I think it's important to really give us I like that they're giving us an insight into the effects of Xantine's rule and what an absolute clusterfuck it all is. And I think it's hilarious. Xantine doesn't know what he's doing. He thinks he does, but he has no fucking clue, and I think it's hilarious. Oh, everything's going to fall apart, and it's just going to be like watching a dumpster fire burn, I think, from here on out. I think Serena's doomed.